World War II is often associated with the unimaginable scale. Great battles on land, in the air, on the water, Battle of Monte Cassino, Battle of Britain, landing in Normandy, Pearl Harbor. Events of great importance. Tragedies that claimed hundreds of thousands of victims, monuments of the past. These are themes often raised in pop culture, directly identified with war and glorified by the so-called Western world, which was located in the center of war. The events of the Ostfront, i.e. the Eastern Front, seem to be put aside in this context. Everyone knows that the war in the East also took place, and that the USSR played a key role in it. But it is often forgotten that it was in the East that the war showed its true hellish face. In recent years, the awareness of the events which took place on the Eastern Front has been increasing, but it is still not as widespread as it should be, if only because of the respect for the victims whose lives were taken by Ostfront. And the number of victims was unimaginable. 30 million people were killed. Perhaps, however, the worst thing is not how many people died, but how they died. Are we even morally entitled to such evaluation? Most of these millions did not die in battle defending their country or sacrificing themselves for greater good. No, the deaths of most of the 30 million people were completely senseless, unplanned, chaotic. One could say that it was a side effect of the real war going on somewhere else. Although, of course, the Eastern Front took the lives of many victims during many, many battles. Many of the victims died of starvation, slowly and cruelly. The description of the images which could be seen at the time is more than terrifying. Piles of still moving skeletons on which thin pale parchments of leather were drawn. Infernal visions of some controversial artist. If anyone looked down at it at all, they would probably think that those creatures were writhing worms. And they were people. People who lived life to the fullest. They loved, dreamed, they had plans. Until recently. Before they were absorbed by utter nonsense. Before they were absorbed by utter depravity. What actually happened in the East? Well, it can be said the Germans decided to test their most controversial and ruthless plans on the Eastern population. Ukrainians, Belarusians, Russians, and many other nations. The first step taken was Baca's hunger plan. Baca was the Reich Minister for Food and Agriculture. He developed his plan in the spring of 1941 as political and economic guidelines for organizations in the East. The plan assumed the confiscation of surplus food from the territories which the Wehrmacht entered, and handed them over to the forces fighting on the Eastern Front. In fact, the inhabitants of the conquered areas were deprived of all food and supplies. The well-thought assumption was to starve up to 30 million people to death. After Baca's plan, the time came for General Plan Ost. It was a huge operation. Its purpose was to fully subordinate all of Central and Eastern Europe. The idea came from the original ideas of war, including the acquisition of living space for racially superior Aryans. It is hard to imagine the terrifying scale of this plan. It assumed almost complete extermination of the population living in the aforementioned areas, and the use of a small percentage of those who stayed alive for hard, exhausting work. As far as Russians were concerned, it was planned to apply the suspension of population growth, which was to lead to their biological annihilation. Admittedly, these plans sound unbelievable, and yet they were real. One cannot forget about the great battles on the Eastern Front. It was there that the biggest and most tragic fights took place. Leningrad, Stalingrad, Kerch, Kiev, Kursk, Minsk, the list goes on. Fortunately, they are spoken about more and more often, restoring their rightful place in history. Few people are aware of this, but it was the Eastern Front that decided the fate of the war. Were it not for the absolute exhaustion of the Germans after the fight against the Russians on their territory, Normandy would not have happened. The plans of the Nazis were inhuman and unimaginable, but Russia's revenge also shocks with its scale and cruelty. Let us mention Operation Bagration, which led to almost complete destruction of the German Army Group Center. As a result of this operation and the fighting in Belarus, Lithuania, and eastern Poland, the USSR regained all the territory lost during the German Operation Barbarossa. The front was pushed from the Vitebsk line all the way to Warsaw. This was the greatest humiliation of the Germans. Russia triumphed, soaking in the blood of their opponents. The enemies of Russia were decimated, and they never managed to raise enough. The war was almost won. Europe often forgets about the Eastern Front, but one could dare to say that today's shape of Europe exists only thanks to the Eastern Front. Today nobody thinks that 80% of the Wehrmacht losses were the result of fighting in the East. But the German losses are the result of the efforts made by the Red Army. While forming a statement that Central and Eastern Europe owes a lot to the Soviets, it is worth giving a thought how much they took in return. A lot of myths have accumulated around the Red Army over the years. Some deviate from the truth only slightly. Others are post-war propaganda and have nothing to do with reality. Especially in the West, Red Army soldiers have a bad reputation, reinforced by images shown in pop culture. But were they really as bad and disorganized as we tend to believe today? The Red Army is most often thought of in the context of a huge mass of human lives sacrificed without reflection, and often without purpose. In the collective consciousness, a Soviet soldier is someone whose life was not taken into account, like hundreds of thousands of pieces of cannon fodder, blindly thrown by ruthless, incompetent, and usually alcohol-abusing commanders, a worthless jumble of random people forced into the army, terribly equipped and technologically lagging behind German troops. We are often presented with the myth of officers standing at the back of the front, shooting their own people in the back. Those who decided to escape from the battlefield, following the instinct to defend their own lives. Even the image of a Russian soldier leaves no doubt. People used to think of the Red Army soldiers as crude, smelly savages, ruthless sociopaths, and rapists who enjoyed torturing others. A Red Army soldier is usually drunk with cheap, smelly moonshine and soaking in the blood of innocent people from the villages that came in his way. It is also worth mentioning that among many myths about the Red Army, there are also such which glorify it, particularly widespread in the countries of the former Eastern Bloc, with emphasis, of course, on the Russian Federation itself. For them, the Red Army is still synonymous with words such as hero and virtuous, honorable nation's savior. In this case, the Red Army is an endless sea of proud, smiling, and brave liberators who, while marching towards Berlin, carried freedom, joy, and respite to the liberated lands. Of course, later, as a sign of gratitude, liberated people erected numerous monuments to them. Truth usually lies in between, and myths always have their origin in reality. The Red Army consisted primarily of young boys and adult men, poorly trained, often actually going to face certain death. Yet, contrary to popular belief, it was death at the hands of the enemy, not the soldiers who stood at the back of the front, firing at Red Army soldiers fleeing the battlefield. In 1942, Stalin issued the famous order, "Not a step back." Pursuant to this order, special units were created to ensure that no soldier escaped from the battlefield. However, their task was never to eliminate deserters. Most often, escapees were forced to return to the front. Being terrified and lost, they died quickly. Admittedly, in extreme cases, those special units could go as far as liquidating soldiers, but such a solution was hardly used. During the war, pragmatism reigned among the USSR troops. If the deserter was not sent back to the front, he landed in a labor camp where he served as cheap labor force. It's also worth asking the question, was the Red Army really as badly armed and as badly organized as we tend to think? It turns out that it wasn't so bad. Admittedly, at the beginning of the war in 1941, as a result of Operation Barbarossa, the Red Army suffered huge losses in equipment, mainly in heavy weapons. But there was never a shortage of small arms. In addition, the United Kingdom initially supported its allies as much as they could. And then, in the second half of 1942, the US aid began to flow in greater amounts. Thus, tracks with American markings appeared in the USSR. Sometimes curious Red Army soldiers were told that Soviet weapons were exported to the States, although in reality it was exactly the opposite. Hence, the Soviet propaganda twisted the image in its own way, and the West, separated from the Russian propaganda by the Iron Curtain, did not have access to the truth and could not know the actual image of the Red Army. The Russians' version was almost automatically rejected as hypocritical and propaganda. But the alternative image was divergent from reality and historical truth. Therefore, the basic source of information was from the German viewpoint, which, like the Soviet one, was far from the truth. And this is how the image of the Red Army soldier was established in the eyes of the Western world. A poorly armed, drunken savage, cannon fodder. Of course, the Russian version also raises considerable and undoubtedly legitimate doubts. The Red Army was also far from brave, joyful, honorable, and the righteous liberators from Soviet propaganda cards. They were not the heroes who carried hope and who bravely expelled the Nazis from the occupied lands. Crimes took place which were then carefully hidden for years. The Red Army soldiers are not noble, proud liberators. Moreover, tortures which deprived their victims of dignity and humanity, the endless plague of violent rapes and mass exterminations are a fact. Anyway, even shooting in the back or the back of the head took place. Although, of course, it was not the Red Army soldiers escaping from the front. In the forests of Eastern Europe, one can find many testimonies of cruelty and senseless murders of civilians, intelligentsia, and people who knew too much. After the fall of the Iron Curtain, the truth slowly came to light. The Russians could no longer comfortably blame the Germans for their crimes. The historical narrative likes extremes. The center, and thus the gist which is closest to the truth, is often overlooked. That is why the myths about the Red Army are so common today. And although there is a bit of truth in every myth, one should not judge any part of any conflict on their basis. War is not only noble uprisings, heroes dying for their homeland, the unimaginable suffering of innocent bystanders and armed struggle to defend the freedom and dignity of people. War is also, or perhaps above all, a test of character and conscience, behind-the-scenes games of rulers, negotiations, secrets, and betrayal. People, guided by the survival instinct, can do unimaginable things. In the face of death, some individuals will not hesitate to renounce their loved ones, and in extreme cases, fooled by empty promises, are willing to sacrifice their lives. Heroes will show up in difficult times. Such heroism, however, can be wasted when, along with the blood that soaks into the ground, any sense of heroism disappears. Heroism and devotion, as well as collaboration, are two inseparable sides of the same coin. The Germans, despite their belief in the superiority of their race, surprisingly often used collaborators in their actions. Formally, they were enemies, be it racial or ideological. Clearly, the sight of a black Wehrmacht soldier was something rather unusual, but single cases also occurred amongst German troops, if the odds were favorable. Not much is said about the fact that up to 150,000 people, who according to German laws, were considered Jews, or perhaps people of at least partial Jewish origin, who then fought in the Wehrmacht. For many, it was the only option to survive, hiding their origin. but there were also those who declared their zealous dedication to the cause of Nazism, although of course rather excluding anti-Semitism. The participation of foreigners in the armed forces of the Third Reich and all support services was much larger than it may seem. Also, Slavic countries were not free from collaborators and people who were forced into the Nazi army. Even citizens of neutral countries, Swiss, Spanish, or Swedish, were sent to the Wehrmacht for various reasons. Some in search of benefits, some fleeing from punishment for their offenses. Occupation in the West was significantly different from that on the Eastern Front. The Western regime was milder, and the situation seemed more acceptable. There were no devastating battles and no mass murder. As a result, the Nazi propaganda was sown on a much more fertile soil. Because people in the West often did not clearly feel the negative effects of occupation as much as, for example, Poles or the Balkan nations. And so tens of thousands of Belgians, Dutchmen, and Frenchmen, often at their own will, found themselves in the German army, encouraged by an extremely efficient Nazi propaganda machine. The unit of the latter, belonging to the Charlemagne Assault Battalion, faithfully defended Berlin and Hitler's bunker against the invading Soviet forces to the very end. While the population of Western countries, through propaganda, could decide whether to support the activities of the Wehrmacht, for many Eastern residents it was only one way to go: collaboration or death. There were also captured Red Army soldiers in the Nazi army, as well as repressed citizens of the USSR who found it easier to decide to cooperate with the enemy. Such a scenario was definitely better for them than death in a prisoner of war camp. Lithuanians, Latvians, Ukrainians. There were many collaborators among these nationalities, often repressed so much by the Soviet state that they were pushed to the full support of the Nazi cause, hoping to improve the quality of their very hard life. Such collaborators often turned out to be extremely ruthless in their actions. There were also Czechs, or finally Poles, of whom almost 500,000 went to the Wehrmacht. Those who had German citizenship before the war, or in order to avoid repression, signed up for the Volkslist, were subject to enforced enlistment, which in turn turned out to be a death sentence on the part of the Soviet Union after the war. After all, Poland is proud of the fact that it was one of the few occupied territories in which volunteer SS units could not be created, but that does not mean there were no collaborators. Fear for one's own life, uncertainty, and a deep sense of injustice always create favorable conditions for trying to improve one's fate by siding with the enemy. Collaboration is not just the army, dramas of insignificant individuals, and the decisions of the repressed people. Collaboration is also governments, high positions, handshakes, and consultations at the highest political levels. There was never a lack of opportunists amongst the rulers. They tried to build their positions and political capital on human tragedies, creating puppet governments directly subordinated to the rule of the Third Reich. When people were passing through hell in concentration camps, receptions to honor the invader were held in palaces. In Europe, there was no shortage of those willing to rule in the country under Hitler's leadership. Vichy in France, Kisling in Norway, Arrow-Cross in Hungary, Croatian Ustaš. These are only some of the groups which successfully decided to cooperate with the Nazis. However, such activities were not always successful. Germany, especially at the end of the war, sought support wherever they could. The purity of the breed moved into the background when the situation on the front became more and more dramatic, and each additional unit allowed to strengthen the hope of winning, or simply surviving. Regardless of nationality, there were people everywhere who were ready to fight. There were people everywhere who were ready to side with the enemy for the slightest benefit. On the other hand, there were also people ready to sacrifice their lives for the nation, the cause, all their loved ones, even for the purity of their conscience. After all, there were also collaborators among the Germans themselves, although this is very easy to forget. Occupation, a word uttered very often in the context of war. This universal term, used somewhat thoughtlessly, implicitly means a situation in which hostile armed forces establish their power in a given territory against the will of the inhabitants and the officially operating administration. Thus, the term itself is quite imprecise. It is worth noting that occupation can take completely different forms and scale. France was occupied exactly like Poland. Germany introduced its rule in Austria, but their iron hand also reached the territories of the USSR. The phases of war were not the same in all these places. They cannot be compared. And it is certainly difficult to talk about the situation of these countries using the same word. Austria, already mentioned before, was one of the first to be ruled by the Nazis. It was incorporated into the borders of the Third Reich before the war in 1938. In the case of Austria, however, we cannot talk about occupation at all. The annexation of this country was rather neutral, and the Austrians themselves were eager to support Hitler, although, of course, just like everywhere, a few rebels also appeared. After Austria, the time came for Czechoslovakia. There, the resistance was not great either. Its citizens knew perfectly that it had no chance to defend the country against a powerful and well-organized German war machine. The government forced quickly subjugated the entire Czechoslovakia to Germany. The administrative division was slightly changed. Separateness was granted to the Slovaks, and seemingly everything was going on normally, as if life for the inhabitants of Czechoslovakia would still go on like before. Of course, one could say that it was calm, if the issues of mass murders of Jews and the brutal extermination of any resistance movements were ignored. Propaganda was active everywhere, and even the states which voluntarily succumbed to the occupation suffered losses, though little was said about it. While talking about countries which were treated mildly by the war in general consciousness, we should mention France. After losing in 1940, the area of France was divided into occupied territories, treated gently by the Germans, and the state of Vichy France, in which Philippe Pétain ruled, was created. The newly created state supported the Wehrmacht units stationed in the area, and even without explicit pressure from Germany, organized roundups of Jews. Nevertheless, separate Nazi actions against the Jewish population and the small groups of rebels operating in the French territory did not cease. Still, things were relatively mild in this area, mainly because the Germans were not interested in exterminating the French. They treated their human resources and their areas of economic and to some extent intellectual facilities to further build the power of the Third Reich. All these factions mean that the number of war casualties in France remains small compared to the occupation in the East. Just like in the case of most countries in which the Nazis managed to create a puppet government, for example in Norway. The situation east of Germany was different. When Hitler's army entered Poland in September 1939, they encountered the first case of real resistance during their expansion. It was impossible to intimidate Poles, force them to surrender and seize Warsaw at an express pace. Poles, still remembering their struggle for independence just 20 years before, did not intend to give up without a fight, despite the lack of any help from outside. And therefore the war did not spare this country. 6 million Polish citizens were killed as a result of hostilities, fights, partisan actions, uprisings, and in the first place, extermination. That is, the general lack of consent to lose independence once more. The occupiers razed the capital city, Warsaw, to the ground. The largest concentration and extermination camps were created in Poland, and Hitler did not think about any concessions. Poland and Polishness were to disappear from the face of the earth in suffering and fear. While in the West the Germans ruled severely but peacefully, their greatest anger fell on the Polish land. The Nazis had no mercy for anyone. Children, women, the elderly. There were no barriers. There was no decency. There was no conscience. The East was to become German living space, so as a nation as rebellious as the Polish was not supposed to exist. The Polish population was not a valuable economic or intellectual base, which was additionally taken care of by the Russians during the war. There was never a chance for a puppet government to be created in Poland. If anyone attempted to do so, they risked the inevitable social lynching. There was no chance for peace. So the only way out was forced pacification and the gradual destruction of Polishness. Germans also found a task for the Poles they conquered. Many was sent to forced cruel labor in Germany. The situation was also difficult in Yugoslavia, although losses were significantly smaller. Despite this, the quickly conquered country was organized like Poland. Government was active in exile, and regular guerrilla warfare took place in Yugoslavia. Greece also found itself in a difficult situation, as it capitulated despite British aid. The Germans did not intend to make life easier for either Poles or Balkan nations. Some of these countries, as well as their populations, were written off as worthless and occupying the living space which should have belonged to the Aryans. Their citizens were of no value. Those who made the mistake of resisting were to be subordinated to the Germans. Terror and fear for their own lives became their daily bread. It should also be noted that the situation was equally horrible in the USSR. The Red Army had no mercy for the Wehrmacht, and the Wehrmacht in turn had no mercy for the local soldiers and civilians. It is hard to call this situation occupation. It was rather mass extermination. It is estimated about 20 million human lives were taken then. The cause of their deaths were different: battles, assaults, hunger. Of course, this number also results from the strategy of Stalin himself, who did not refrain from taking risky decisions and sacrificing his own people. Putting France and Norway and Poland and the USSR on the opposite axis, we see two different realities and completely different faces of war. War which, in all its cruelty, treated victims differently in different parts of Europe. The Holocaust brought destruction to countless innocent lives. There is no doubt about that. Around 6 million Jews were killed, including about 2 million children. How is it possible that in the 20th century, in the middle of the continent which is a symbol of culture and Western civilization, in addition remembering the horrors of the previous Great War, there occurred a mass planned extermination of millions of human lives? How did the death factories operate in areas occupied by the Nazis, in which people were murdered almost on an industrial scale for a significant part of the war? Why did the Allies do nothing to stop the process of genocide during the war? Did they even know about the ongoing Holocaust? And finally, since the massive shedding of innocent blood was not stopped, can it be said that in this way the Allies are also responsible for the Holocaust? It is difficult to answer these questions, and moral judgments elude simple black and white logic. So, could the fact of the existence of extermination camps such as Auschwitz-Birkenau, for example, not reach the ears of war decision-makers in Great Britain or the United States? Certainly not. The case gained more publicity in December 1942 thanks to Edward Brzezinski, the Polish Minister of Foreign Affairs of the government in exile. He wrote a note about the persecution and crimes against the Jewish population, which was handed over to the ministers of foreign affairs of the Allied states. Considering how Allied decision-makers are being glorified today, one could conclude that the result of receiving the note was an immediate reaction and actions aimed at stopping the extermination machine. However, reality can be much more cruel. The Allies did not even try to negotiate with the Nazis. Efforts were made to pretend that the case was gone, and the note was never in their hands. Moreover, it was not the first time the news spread across the Western world about the mass extermination of the Jewish population by the Nazis. Rumors of mass extermination of Jews had appeared a few months earlier thanks to a telegram sent by Gerhard Reigner, a representative of the World Jewish Congress, addressed to the American consulate in Geneva. Reigner warned the Americans against the Nazi plans to murder all European Jews. After the information spread, individual notes began to appear in the press, but attempts were still made to prevent the problem from being made public. After Rosinski's note, nothing could be done. The frightening information spread across the world. After the spread of the information about the Holocaust, various parties began to press for decisive and appropriate actions to be taken by the Allied governments and troops as soon as possible. Unfortunately, despite the discussions and the search for the most optimal solution, no action was taken. The most frequently used conclusion was depressing. Nothing could be done. However, it can't be denied that the Allies weren't trying to find a solution. Ideas were different, more or less risky. One of the first postulates, for example, was the start of retaliatory murder of prisoners of war. From a post-war perspective, however, it can be said that such actions would have been extremely dangerous, leading to even greater escalation of the war and, as a result, perhaps even its prolongation and increase of the already unimaginable number of victims and material losses. In April 1943, while the streets of Warsaw flowed in the blood of Jews during the Ghetto Uprising, representatives of the USA and Great Britain organized the Bermuda Conference. Its purpose was to create an assistance plan for European Jews, related primarily to the safe resettlement of people living in areas affected or potentially affected by the ongoing war. In addition, they wondered how to allow escape for those who stayed in the territories occupied by the Third Reich. The conference did not bring any effects, solutions, or new ideas. Even the migration limits were not raised, and they would facilitate the escape of the few Jews who could have had such a chance. The consensus of the conference was one: stopping the Holocaust was only possible by winning the war as soon as possible. The conference evoked very sharp negative reactions of the Jewish communities and the press. It was said that noble gentlemen were deliberating human lives in terms of statistics, assuring each other that nothing can be done. There was one conclusion: stopping the Holocaust was only possible by winning the war as soon as possible. Type scripts recording the sessions in Bermuda have been preserved until today. It is difficult to assess whether war decision-makers lacked an idea, courage, and determination, or if nothing could be done directly. And in fact, the only sensible actions were taken, that is, those aimed at winning the war. Nothing will ever change the fact that by the end of the war, the population of European Jews decreased by 55 to 60%. The Jewish tragedy in the form of the Holocaust was undoubtedly huge. But one should also remember that the German extermination machine also took the lives of about 26 million Russians, 3 million Poles, 1 million citizens of Yugoslavia, a large part of the Roma population, and many, many more. War is a time of tragedy and suffering, a time when the toughest characters are put to the test and will often be unable to cope with the situation they're facing. However, after all, this is also the time when real heroes appear in the world. Those who will be talked about for dozens and maybe hundreds of years after the conflict ends. Such heroes, especially for Polish citizens, were the silent unseen, who risked their lives and carried out almost impossible missions, which could determine the outcome of the conflict. The official name of the silent unseen, Cichociemeni, was Cichociemeni Paratroopers of the Home Army, and during the war they were nicknamed Birdmen or Throwers in Polish. At the beginning, it is worth considering who they were exactly, and under which flag, at least formally, they fought. They belonged to the Polish Armed Forces, but their training took place in Great Britain and Italy. It was comprehensive training, giving them knowledge and skills in many fields, far beyond traditional military training. The Silent Unseen were therefore fluent in melee combat, sabotage and tactics, and prepared to perform command functions. The Silent Unseen were not a standard military formation. They did not belong to a specific unit or battalion. They had no formal structures, colors, or traditions. And although they were established by the official order of the Commander-in-Chief of the Home Army, it can be said that they did not officially exist. At least, because of the particularly dangerous and complex nature of their actions, no one was supposed to know about their existence. The name under which they are known today initially referred to the fact that after reporting to the special unit, volunteers imperceptibly disappeared from their respective departments. The future Silent Unseen were trained from 1940. It is noteworthy that although, as the official name indicated, they were primarily a parachuting group, it was difficult to find experienced paratroopers among Polish soldiers. In the end, almost 600 people were selected from several thousand volunteers, who, after intensive training, took the oath of the Silent Unseen. 316 soldiers were dropped to Poland, and about a dozen were sent to other occupied European countries. The most famous Silent Unseen operations include 3 actions codenamed Wildhorn, carried out in 1944. They were unusual actions, which only a comprehensive and perfectly trained unit could handle. The gist of the actions was not actually a drop of soldiers, but landing on the area of the enemy using a makeshift airport and taking important people and documents from the country. The plan had a lot of aspects which could have led to absolute failure of the mission, which was so dangerous that the English did not want to agree to carry it out, and to make the plane available for a long time. The first landing, Wildhorn 1, showed the scale of the threat resulting from undertaking actions which were so reckless and difficult to plan. The Polish Underground Army managed to secure the makeshift landing pad, but caught the attention of the Germans, which resulted in the death of 40 people. Ultimately, however, the action was successful. The Silent Unseen were delivered to Poland, and important people, documents, and microfilms with materials which were extremely important for the Allies were taken from the country. The next action went much more efficiently and without direct casualties. The plane only spent a few minutes on the ground and remained undetected, although 2 people who were to leave the country did not reach the landing site. The Wildhorn 3 action was the most important of all. Poles came into direct possession of the V-2 missile. It was the first structurally successful ballistic missile created by the Germans. Transporting its fragments and plans developed by Polish technicians became the priority of the Silent Unseen. The action was constantly threatened. First, the buried wheels of the aircraft prevented the machine from taking off from the airport in Poland. And then it turned out that the wheels could not be hidden due to the leakage of hydraulic fluid. Multiple threats arose. The destination could not be reached, the aircraft passengers could die, and materials which could affect the fate of the war could be lost. Ultimately, the liquid was replenished with water and tea. The soldiers remained calm, and despite the threat, they were able to seek creative solutions. Of course, the Wildhorn actions are not the only activities carried out by the Silent Unseen. They often carried out direct operations, such as sending a small squad to rescue valuable people from the enemy's hands, causing a diversion, or simply carrying out missions that no one else would undertake. They required above-average cunning, attention, and physical effort. Lack of attention could lead not only to death, but also to diplomatic scandals. The Silent Unseen dealt with the elimination of particularly dangerous enemies, obtaining the most important data, and all special missions that required appropriate training. The way the Home Army found out about planned drops was extremely interesting. Radio broadcasts from London were listened to from dawn to dusk. If an agreed Polish song appeared during the broadcast, it meant that a drop would be made the following night. The place depended on the song which was broadcast. The Silent Unseen could change the fate of the people they met during the war. They carried hope, improved morale, and above all, they did not shy away from deadly tasks. There is a reason why their legend continues to this day, and Poles see themselves as an example of courage and exemplary military attitude. The Silent Unseen are considered the prototype of contemporary Polish special forces. The German occupation of the eastern lands, like the whole Ostfront, was an unimaginable tragedy for the inhabitants of these areas. Warfare took tens of millions of lives. The world of hundreds of millions collapsed during those cruel, long 6 years. After years of Nazi rule, the first beacon of hope appeared in Eastern Europe. Finally, the victorious Red Army moved towards Berlin. Residents of towns and villages oppressed by the Germans anticipated characteristic Soviet uniforms, and the Nazis escaping in panic. Many Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Poles believed that this was the moment when their fate would change, and the hopeless situation would at least slightly improve. That the Soviet army would, despite everything, return the liberated lands to their rightful owners. Many were aware that the liberated would not handle the liberated ones gently, but it seemed to be a better scenario than even more years of war. Ultimately, it turned out that for many people, the real nightmare was just beginning. Today we already know what the march of the so-called Liberation Red Army towards Berlin looked like, and how much evil and suffering it brought. And yet the version of the events, consolidating the image of a brave, honorary Red Army soldier who, regardless of his own life, fought for the freedom of the liberated lands, was presented to the inhabitants of the Eastern Bloc countries for many years. There is no doubt that the history is written by the victors, and the Soviet authorities were extremely consistent in shaping the propaganda of the war, according to which the Germans were responsible for all evil, and the Russians were good, righteous heroes. In Poland, there is a popular proverb, to get under the rainwater gutter after the rain. It perfectly reflects the situation of the Poles at the end of the war. The country, completely destroyed by the wrath of the Nazis, became a field of uncontrolled, less but also destructive actions of the Red Army soldiers, deepening the chaos and collapse of rebirthing Poland. At the beginning, it is worth mentioning that after the division of the zones according to the secret protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Red Army entered Poland as early as September 17, 1939, breaking the Polish-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact concluded in 1932, which was to remain in force until 1945, potentially to be prolonged. Until 1941, the Russians occupied eastern Poland, committing unimaginable crimes. During this period, about 1 million Poles were exiled to Siberia. The Katyn massacre took place. Over 21,000 Polish citizens, representatives of elites and intelligentsia, were killed by the NKVD by a shot in the back of the head. It was a deliberate action whose goal was to facilitate the creation of new elites and intellectual and political structures in Poland, subordinated to the USSR. For many years after the war, the Russians stated that Germans were responsible for Katyn. In 1941, the Nazis also attacked the USSR itself. The lands occupied by the Soviets so far passed into their hands. Only 3 years later, in 1944, the situation changed radically. That period brought a range of successes from the Allies and the retreat of German troops, gradually being pushed back by the Red Army. For Poles, this meant liberation from the hands of the occupier, but they had to wait over 40 years for real independence. Poles liberated from the Nazi yoke found themselves under the rule of a usurper who did not shun robberies, rapes, and unjust murders of civilians, often simply for the entertainment of officers. The march of the Soviets was even more terrible because they did not stick to any resolutions. They did not respect honor, principles, and values. Home Army detachments which fought Wehrmacht side by side with the Red Army in the last phase of the war were betrayed, disarmed, and arrested by Soviet soldiers at the first opportunity. Home Army soldiers who did not agree to be incorporated into the Polish army subordinate to the Soviets and did not want to cooperate were killed or sent to labor camps. By destroying this last manifestation of resistance, the Russians were free to bring their rule to Poland, which they did consistently. On July 22, 1944, that is just before the end of the war, the Polish Committee of National Liberation was created, completely subordinated to the authorities of the USSR. War and betrayal took away the defense forces of the Polish nation for many years. so the communists, supervised by Stalin, did not have major problems in establishing state structures in their newly created territories of Poland that were in line with their own expectations. Speaking of the so-called liberation, one cannot ignore the issue of the Upper Silesian tragedy, or in general the fate of Poles who were in any way connected with Germany. When the Red Army entered Upper Silesia in the beginning of 1945, they bloodily dealt with people who had previously obtained the status of Volksdeutsch, i.e. people of German origin, living outside Germany. Also those who did it against their beliefs in order to save themselves and their families. Many innocent Silesians were then deported deep into Russia or disappeared without a trace. The size of this tragedy is emphasized by the fact that people trying to save themselves in unimaginably difficult circumstances paid the highest price when they thought the worst was over. The topic of Silesians and the Volksdeutsch is a link to another great tragedy, related to the liberation of the East by the Soviets. Unbelievable hell broke loose when the Red Army crossed the former Polish borders and reached the areas inhabited by the German population. Revenge was the main motivation of the Soviets. There were no restrictions or bans. On the contrary, Red Army soldiers were encouraged to act brutally and cruelly. It all came down to retaliation and destruction. Its most terrifying form were brutal rapes. The problem had already appeared in the liberated lands, but in Germany it became a cold-blooded regular activity. The Russians were ruthless. Their victims were children and old women. It is assumed that in Germany alone, Red Army soldiers raped over 2 million women. Many of them died at the hands of torturers, but those who survived often took their own lives. Sometimes they even killed their own children, with the intention to spare them the necessity of living with unimaginable trauma. It happened that entire families committed suicide even before the Red Army entered, just to protect themselves from cruelty. Soviet soldiers entered Poland in 1944, and they only left it in the early 1990s, when Poland really regained independence, and the Polish People's Republic transformed into the Third Polish Republic. Throughout this period, the Soviet Union tirelessly built its image of a liberator and concealed the truth about the crimes of the Red Army, often blaming the Germans for its own faults. American pop culture also contributed to the hypocritical image of the Red Army in the minds of the West, often showing an idealized image of the Allied Red Army from World War II, even despite the tensions arising from the Cold War, which was a direct consequence of post-war decisions and arrangements.
The uprising in Poland had been planned for a long time. From the very beginning of the war and the appearance of the Nazis in the country, Warsaw residents were preparing for another armed struggle. The Germans took over the capital of Poland, but Warsaw never really gave up. Poles did not have their country for too long. They could not lose it again. Thus, Home Army soldiers hiding in Warsaw were waiting for an order to commence the fights. But the order did not come. Thousands of people ready for the uprising lived in chaos and disinformation. Varsovians were motivated to fight. They also had a certain amount of weapons, which, given the element of surprise, gave hope for a successful fight against the Nazis. Meanwhile, more and more people died day after day in the streets of the occupied Polish capital. Infirmity and stagnation aroused rage in Home Army soldiers who were waiting for a signal to fight. They had to watch the Germans line up and shoot their loved ones, family, friends, and acquaintances. They were soldiers. They swore to obey orders. Some were ready to start the uprising arbitrarily, but they decided not to do it. So the question arises, what were the headquarters of the Home Army waiting for? Why were they delaying the start of the uprising, despite the fact that time worked in their favor? And the Germans began to withdraw from the capital, which meant that their strength was extremely limited.
The Home Army headquarters wanted to make sure that this was the right moment, that the uprising had a chance of success. Unfortunately, certainty never came, so they waited further for the Red Army. Why did the Varsovians decide to start the uprising at all, if the German troops were withdrawing from Poland in fear of the approaching Red Army? Why take the risk in a situation where it would seem that the worst was over? The plan was simple. Soviet soldiers entered the city controlled by Poles who, represented by the authorities of the Polish underground state, welcomed them as hosts. This was to show the supremacy of the Polish underground state command over the Polish Committee of National Liberation, established with the support of the Soviets, and to ensure a political advantage during the rebuilding of the Polish state. As we know from today's perspective, this plan unfortunately failed completely. However, it was known that a lonely fight against Germany could not be successful, even in favorable circumstances. Therefore, it was decided that the uprising would begin a few days before the Red Army entered Warsaw, which would support Poles in getting rid of, according to the assumption, losing Germans. The mere threat of Soviet troops entering the battle with the Poles was to significantly weaken the Wehrmacht's morale. Finally, in the last days of July, information appeared on the streets of the city that the Russians had reached the vicinity of Warsaw. The Home Army headquarters issued the long-awaited order signed by General Tadeusz Komorowski. On August 1, 1944 at 5 p.m., the W hour came. The largest liberation uprising in occupied Europe and the great tragedy of tens of thousands of people. This decision meant that Warsaw would never be the same as before. The worst was yet to come. The Russians did not enter Warsaw. They cynically awaited its complete fall, which was Stalin's plan from the very beginning. Poles wanted to trick the Soviets, using the Red Army to strengthen their position in the future structures of reborn Poland, and ultimately they ended up tricked and exploited. Stalin decided to enter when the battle was over. Enter the city, which certainly would not put up any resistance. On the first day, 25,000 to 36,000 guerrillas stood up to fight. It is difficult to determine the exact number today. They had 1,000 rifles and not many more guns at their disposal. Ammunition were supposed to be enough for a few days of fighting. After all, according to the original plan, after a few days the uprising was to end with the entry of the Red Army. The insurgents had serious difficulties with communication. Despite the long waiting period and months of planning, or maybe because of them, they were dramatically unprepared. Difficulties arose with the access to the hidden weapons storage, which meant that at the beginning of the fighting, the insurgents had less than half of the already modest arsenal at their disposal.
Initially, there were definitely less Germans than the Home Army soldiers, about 16,000. The Wehrmacht forces were retreating through Warsaw after a humiliating defeat on the front, but the city itself was to be defended. However, they did not lack weapons. They also had tanks, planes, and all possible tools to facilitate the extermination of the population. The disproportion of strength was unimaginable. And so the Varsovians ended up alone, unarmed, unorganized, forgotten, and used in the most cynical way. The Russians had no mercy and waited for Warsaw to fall. The Germans had no mercy either, and responded to the armed uprising with all their strength. It was the end of the city that Warsaw citizens knew. During the uprising, which lasted for 63 days, the residents of Warsaw tried to arrange their lives in a new, strange, and terrifying reality. The voices of the street were divided. Some expressed enthusiasm. Some were terrified. One can speak about the uprising and its reality for a long time. Ultimately, the terrifying scale of the uprising must be analyzed. The uprising took the lives of up to 180,000 civilians who were not related to the activities of the Home Army or the Polish underground state, and about 16,000 insurgents who were killed in the fights alone. At Hitler's order, over 70% of the city was completely destroyed. And although the uprising became a symbol of hope, heroism, and steadfastness,
It cannot be denied that it ended in catastrophe. And let the number witness the catastrophe. In one of the districts of Warsaw, named Wola, more than 12 tons of ashes remaining after the burning bodies of fallen Warsaw residents were collected. Adolf Eichmann had the gut feeling that the absurd plan could not succeed. However, there was no turning back now. The information, although unofficial, had already spread. Just before making the decision, a single trickle of sweat ran down his forehead. He did a lot of harm in his life, although he did not consider himself a man without conscience. What he proposed was not even in the 10th part as cruel as the whole of Nazi crimes, including those that were still plans. And yet this very day and this task were a special challenge for him. Who was Adolf Eichmann? German-Austrian Gestapo, coming from a happy family who never lacked anything. He had Jewish maternal relatives, whom he helped in escaping from the territories of the Third Reich in 1943, where they would be exterminated as part of the plan to finally solve the Jewish question, of which Eichmann was the main contractor and superior.
He also largely contributed to the clarification of the details of the final solution plan at the famous Nazi conference in Wannsee, a district of Berlin, on January the 20th, 1942. Then the methods and details of extermination were discussed, such as that pure-blood Jews should be physically eliminated and half-blood Jews sterilized.
Or maybe Eichmann treated it all as one big joke. Maybe he was so washed out of any human impulses that he enjoyed trading life. Did the dripping sweat on his forehead indicate stress? Or an attempt to remain serious? Even the best observer would not know. How many Jews does a truck cost? This question, resonating with its cruelty and a kind of awkwardness in the face of the Holocaust, must have come that day. Eichmann called his proposal blood for merchandise. He wanted to send 1 million Jewish prisoners detained in Hungary back to a neutral country in exchange for 10,000 trucks, tea, coffee, and other goods. The war saw many unusual things: cruelty and irony of history, dramas of individuals, and skillful negotiations at the highest levels of power. But what was proposed on May 25, 1944 is incredible. How desperate were the Nazis in the last phase of the war? Exchanging the lives of 1 million people for trucks is extremely desperate, but above all, cynical. Probably nobody played with someone else's life on such a huge scale before or later. It is not surprising that the Allies did not accept this proposal, correctly suspecting that it was a procedure aimed at encouraging the West to commence separate peace negotiations. The situation in Germany was so bad that focusing on the Eastern Front and alleviating the situation in the West were seen as the greatest chance of exiting the war. The truce, assuming that the Third Reich would retain some of the conquered lands, seemed to be the perfect solution, especially after the Soviets destroyed the German Army Group Center. The threat of the Red Army entering Berlin became more real, and the Nazi movements became more and more chaotic. The Western decision-makers had to face a challenge, and the final answer was undoubtedly the right thing from a strategic point of view. Peace negotiations with Germany at this stage of the war did not make any sense, and building the enemy's belief that they were in a negotiating position was not beneficial. Nonetheless, the rejection of Eichmann's proposal remains, to put it mildly, morally questionable. It can therefore be assumed that the West sacrificed the lives of 1 million Jews in the name of strategic moves. In the end, most of them eventually died in Auschwitz. The Allies did not bend over their fate, although it may seem that they had a real chance to save an unimaginably large number of lives. But would negotiations really work? Doubts are fully justified. In retrospect, it all sounds like a huge irony of history. But this entire situation carries the unimaginable tragedy of millions of people. Millions. Because in addition to the drama of Hungarian Jews, it reflects the echo of desperate Germans rapidly losing people and supplies. Finally, in the background, there is the intimate tragedy of those who had to make the decision not to negotiate when it came to the lives of 1 million people. And what happened to Adolf Eichmann? His life is a separate story, by the way, eagerly told. A boy from a good family, brought up by an extremely nationalist father, who climbed the career ladder. And although he never belonged to the highest elite of the Nazis, was one of the most important architects of the apocalypse. It was him who became the face of the most monstrous crimes of the Nazis. Even before the end of the war, he admitted that he was proud of his role in the extermination of millions of innocent people, or in his opinion, the enemies of the Reich. He almost escaped justice, fleeing like so many other Nazis to Argentina. He lived there peacefully until 1960, when he was captured by Mossad and transported to Israel. His trial took place there. Many unimaginable details of his life were revealed in its course. Despite his committed and fierce defense, he was sentenced to death. He was hanged in 1962. War is unpredictable and teaches us to be prepared for everything. But preparation for such a situation is impossible. Hungarian Jews probably could not have been saved anyway. However, there always remains a quiet question. What if? War has changed the world. Although it ended many years ago, the echo of the horrors which it brought resounds to this day, and its effects are still shaping the world. The deaths of over 60 million people, suffering, concentration camps, torture, rape, and hunger of the next tens of millions have forever changed the course of history. Their memory must not be buried in oblivion. However, one should not overlook the enormous, direct impact that war had on the economy, not only in the context of the reduction of labor resources. The war almost redefined economics, among other things, causing huge material losses to many countries, losses which have not been settled to this day. The destruction of entire cities, infrastructure, reserves, crops, workplaces, factories, military equipment, and many other economically important goods and units was enormous and undermined the economic status of affected countries for decades. The scale leaves no doubt. It was necessary to identify the guilty ones. The losers had to comply, at least by design, and in an ideal scenario. The first attempts to account for losses caused by hostilities were made during the meeting of the leaders of the most important Allied countries, Winston Churchill, Franklin Roosevelt, and Joseph Stalin in Yalta. The main topic of this conference was the division of German lands amongst the winners, which ultimately led to the outbreak of the Cold War and a clear division of the world. The discussion continued in Potsdam shortly after the fighting ceased. However, without Roosevelt, who died shortly before the meeting and was replaced by the new U.S. President, Harry Truman. During the conference, Churchill also had to give up his seat and welcome new British Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. Potsdam was the last conference of the so-called Big Three. There, next to Tehran and Yalta, decisions which shaped the world we know today were made. One could say the world under Stalin's dictation. While discussing reparations, the largest countries are usually taken into account, ignoring the smaller ones, though no less affected by the war. In this context, the controversial plan of the Dutch is particularly noteworthy. It assumed the takeover of a significant part of the border areas of Germany, exactly 1,750 square kilometers, where several hard coal mines were located, and the expulsion of their native inhabitants. The Dutch Territory Enlargement Committee was created. Of course, the Allies did not agree and did not take the Dutch plan seriously. Nevertheless, 2 small German villages covering an area of 69 square kilometers were incorporated into the Netherlands. They were under the Dutch rule from 1949 to 1963, when they were returned to their rightful owners. Post-war compensation, i.e. reparations, were an equally significant topic. The Allies did not want to repeat the mistakes of the Versailles Treaty after the Great War. The high payments ordered then provoked resistance and eventually ceased to be regulated. They also led to further conflicts, which culminated in the form of the just-ended Second World War. Therefore, the approach to the reparations was relatively mild. They tried not to require any unpayable sums, and not to lead to further economic destruction of the countries which were obliged to cover them. First of all, the reparations were not supposed to take the monetary form, and came from the dismantling of equipment, factories and production lines, as well as other valuable goods located in Germany and Austria, occupied by the Allies. Of course, other countries allied with the Nazis during the war were also charged with the obligation to pay war reparations, but definitely smaller. For example, Italians paid reparations, among others to Greece and Albania, although problems occurred in the process, especially in the context of Greece. Shortly after the war, the Russians strengthened their influence in Central and Eastern Europe. One of the elements of building the dominant position of the USSR was stating that reparations for Poland, which was one of the most ruined countries during World War II, would be paid by the Soviet Union itself as a percentage of compensation received from the Germans. This action was aimed at gaining stronger control over the international and economic situation of Poland, which the USSR sought to subordinate to its policy. Obviously, the Russians did not intend to support Poland in a really valuable way or give away a part of reparations which proved to be significant from the point of view of the USSR. Therefore, old wagons and even Marxist books were sent to the Polish People's Republic. Russians kept more valuable items recovered from the Nazis, including those from German lands incorporated into Poland, for themselves. The balance of such transfers, although not very favorable for Poland, to some extent, however, contributed to the reconstruction of the destroyed country, in which almost everything was missing, including, for example, wagons. However, it was not enough for the Soviets to limit the possibilities of economic reconstruction. On August 23, 1953, under the pressure of Stalin, the government of the Polish People's Republic waived any claims for war reparations against Germany. Today, there are doubts whether this waiver was in accordance with the law, although most experts and the Polish government itself recognize it. For example, the Greeks have similar doubts and are still in dispute with Germany, fighting for the compensation of almost 300 billion euro. The countries of former Yugoslavia also raised demands for their reparations. While discussing the restrictions imposed by Russia, it is worth mentioning the Marshall Plan. It was established in 1947 and assumed considerable financial assistance provided by America to European countries most damaged by the war. The assistance was initially offered to the Western countries, but also to the USSR, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The Russians did not accept the offered help, and under their influence, Poland and Czechoslovakia also rejected the money. There is no doubt that such a decision affected the economic condition of these countries to a significant extent. It can be considered that Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia would be stronger economically if they had accepted the assistance related to the Marshall Plan. On the other hand, Germany, striving for reconciliation and post-war redress, fought behind the scenes to avoid paying all liabilities even before the unification. Therefore, it is worth asking the question, can we really talk about reconciliation and forgiving the nightmare of war if there was no full compensation? It is August 6, 1945. Tsutomu Yamaguchi is doing business in Hiroshima. Everything is going smoothly and according to plan. It is 8:15. This is going to be a good day. All of a sudden, Tsutomu sees a blinding, overwhelming flash. For a brief moment, he thinks he has not seen anything so beautiful before. Then a sudden, indescribable feeling tells him that this is the last thing he will see in his life. But it was not the case. Yamaguchi turned out to be a very lucky man. Even though he did not avoid serious injuries, he survived the attack of the little boy, a nuclear bomb dropped on Hiroshima from the Enola Gay bomber. He was incredibly lucky in his misfortune. Thousands of others were evaporated immediately, or were incinerated, died in agony from burns, or later radiation sickness went through hell. Tsutomu spent the night in an anti-aircraft bunker, and managed to return to his hometown where he lived and worked every day. To Nagasaki. It is August the 9th, 1945. Tsutomu Yamaguchi returns to work just 3 days after an unimaginable nightmare, the events of Hiroshima. His decision is dictated by honor and a sense of duty, which is typical of Japanese culture. Naturally, his associates are interested in the events from Hiroshima. Tsutomu tells the whole story to his supervisor. On impulse, he looks through the window and sees the same flash as 3 days earlier. Thus, he becomes Niju Hibakusha. This is what people call the survivors of 2 nuclear explosions. For those we know, there were 165 cases. What could Yamaguchi possibly experience for the fractions of a second before he slipped into unconsciousness? Words can certainly not convey this feeling. Tsutomu died on March 4th, 2010. He was an active member of the anti-nuclear movement all his life. Was the dropping of nuclear bombs on defenseless cities a war crime? Especially since it was motivated not only by the desire to force the surrender of Japan, but also to test a new weapon. Victims of which were not only Japanese soldiers and civilians, but also many Korean forced laborers and even individual Allied prisoners. Some will argue that the invasion of the Japanese islands would have resulted in many more casualties. Others that the capitulation could have been forced some other way, but didn't the conventional air raid on Tokyo in March 1945 result in even more casualties than the nuclear explosion? Did the victims of the firestorm in Hamburg, who were bombed in an operation codenamed Gomorrah, ominously referring to the God-destroyed biblical city, feel any difference knowing that they died from ordinary bombs? What about the casualties charred in Dresden? History is written by winners. If these deeds are being committed by the Germans or the Japanese, we would not hesitate to condemn them. On the other hand, are we supposed to throw flowers on the heads of enemies who are unpretentious and morally unscrupulous? The Allies, yes, the Western ones, without counting the USSR, committed crimes which left no place for doubt. Also in the light of the then military law. Defend yourself. It could be your mother, your wife, your sister, your daughter, said an Italian fascist propaganda poster with an image of a woman being abused by a black soldier. Disgusting racist propaganda? Well, not entirely without any basis. The Gumi, Moroccan auxiliary soldiers of the French Expeditionary Corps in Italy, did not hold back from mass rape, robbery, and murder. Gloomy legends were told about their behavior. One even claimed that the French commander, Alphonse Juin, had promised the Gumi 50 hours of impunity before the Battle of Monte Cassino, whatever they would do. While historians verified that these words were never spoken, the suffering of the victims was real. We will never know how many victims there actually were. The French authorities recognized the claims of less than 1,500 victims of sexual violence after the war. But the Italians had to pay them compensation. There is no army without violence or crime. This is pure statistics. War reveals deeply hidden evil among ordinary people. The Allies murdered German prisoners of war for no reason. Frustration, fear, hate, or maybe a purely pragmatic solution. Cases are known when the Allied commanders themselves ordered the killing of prisoners, when taking care of them made it difficult to complete the task. The need for revenge, undoubtedly. Sides of the conflict provoke each other to greater and worse crimes. But the history is written by the winners, and the losers, well, they're on the wrong side. They are the ones who are sued. Nuremberg, a triumph with a dose of bitterness. It is enough to say that Iona Nikitchenko was the judge on behalf of the USSR. The blood on his hands had not yet dried up after participating in the Stalinist show trials as part of the Great Purge in the late 1930s. What about the famine in Bengal with at least 2 million casualties? Did British politics not contribute to the scale of this crisis, apart from nature and the ongoing war? What about the US Navy's unlimited submarine warfare in the Pacific? Was it any different from what the U-boats were doing in the Atlantic? And what about the bombing of hospital ships? What about the American rapes of Japanese or German women committed after the war, or even of liberated French women? Such questions can go on for a long time. Nevertheless, there is no equality between the behavior of the Allies and the crimes of the Axis powers. The Allies are not blameless, there is no doubt about it. But it cannot be said that they were the same as the Germans or the Japanese. Their behavior is not the result of the state's policy of murder in the occupied territories, treating Jews and Slavs as subhuman, as in the case of the Reich, or similar to what the Japanese did in China, which is often forgotten today. The scale and moral judgment remain unambiguous. The behavior of the Allies was a side effect of the war. War releases evil. Fear breeds hatred. Hatred breeds violence. Violence breeds a desire for revenge. Revenge breeds crime. And crime breeds fear. Therefore, when asking provocative questions, it is worth considering the nature of war, especially World War II, usually presented as a fight between good and evil. History shows that such conflicts are not black and white, and the good ones also get their hands dirty in the mud of fights.